Jane Eyre, a summary of an English novel. In 1825, when I was 10 years old, my mom and dad had passed away. I stayed with my aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Reed, at Gateshead Hall, a house in Yorkshire, England. They had 2 kids, John and Eliza. I liked my uncle, but when he died, everything changed. My aunt wasn't nice and my cousins were mean to me. One cold, rainy day in December, I just wanted to read alone. But John came in, grabbed my book, and hit me with it. I screamed, fought back, and Aunt Reed punished me, saying I was bad. When I said I wanted to leave, she decided to send me to Mr. Brocklehurst's school. Mr. Brocklehurst was strict and scary. He said God punishes bad kids and that I'd be punished at his school. I agreed to go, hoping to leave that house behind. 2 weeks later, I left for Lowood School, far away. It was January when I arrived. I got there at night, and a servant took me to a big, dark bedroom full of beds. I slept but woke up early to a loud bell, feeling cold and watching the other girls. The girls at Lowood School woke early, washed in cold water, and dressed quickly. I found a plain dress and heavy shoes by my bed, quickly dressing before heading downstairs. The food was awful, and when one girl complained, a teacher silenced us. We then started classes, which were boring reading and answering questions. After a freezing outdoor break, lessons resumed. Weeks passed, and one day, the head teacher, Miss Temple, and Mr. Brocklehurst visited. I tried to hide, but Mr. Brocklehurst called me out, saying I was bad and making me stand on a high chair for 2 hours. That night, I cried, but Miss Temple comforted me, saying I was a good student. Lowood School was in bad shape: wet, cold buildings, poor food, and many girls fell sick. Some even died. Miss Temple cared for the ill, and eventually Mr. Brocklehurst had to improve things, though he never came back. The next year, the school moved to a better place with new bright buildings, happier teachers, and a healthier environment. At Lowood School, I found happiness. I spent 6 years as a student and 2 more as a teacher before moving on. The Reeds never contacted me again. In 1833, at 18, Miss Temple, my beloved teacher, left. Feeling the need for change, I decided to become a governess. I advertised my skills and received a reply from Mrs. Fairfax of Thornfield Hall near Millcote, about 70 miles away. I eagerly traveled there, and upon arrival, Mrs. Fairfax greeted me warmly. She introduced me to a cozy room by the fire and offered me food. Mrs. Fairfax was kind, and I felt hopeful about my stay. I asked about Miss Fairfax, assuming she was my pupil, but Mrs. Fairfax corrected me. My pupil was Adele Barron, a ward cared for by Mr. Rochester, the owner of Thornfield Hall. Mr. Rochester was often away, and Mrs. Fairfax managed the house. Exhausted, Mrs. Fairfax guided me to my room up the grand staircase. I had a good night's sleep and woke early to a sunny morning. Dressed in a simple black dress, I explored Thornfield Hall, a beautiful house with large windows and stunning gardens. Mrs. Fairfax greeted me, informing me about Adele, my pupil, whom I began teaching in the schoolroom. Later, Mrs. Fairfax gave me a tour of the house, showing me the paintings, furniture, and even taking me up to the roof to admire the countryside. However, on our way back, we heard an odd laugh from a locked door. Mrs. Fairfax brushed it off as Grace Poole, a worker in the house. 3 months went by without meeting Mr. Rochester, Thornfield Hall's owner. One January day, I decided to walk to the nearby village of Hay, hoping for a change of scenery. I set out for the village of Hay, about 2 miles from Thornfield Hall, to mail a letter. Despite the cold, fine day, as I neared the village, a large black and white dog dashed past me, followed by a man on a horse. Moments later, I heard a commotion and the horse slipped on the icy ground, throwing the man off. Concerned, I approached and offered help. The man, around 35, had a strong face, dark eyes, and black hair. He wasn't conventionally handsome but had a robust presence. He mentioned being in pain from his fall. Identifying myself as the governess from Thornfield Hall, I offered to fetch help, but he slowly stood up, using my shoulder for support. After assisting him onto his horse, he urged me to hurry home. Once in the village to post my letter, I noticed bright lights upon my return to Thornfield Hall. Inside, a familiar black and white dog greeted me. I inquired about the dog's owner and learned it belonged to Mr. Rochester, who had returned but had injured his foot due to the horse fall. Smiling to myself, I realized who the man I had helped was. Mr. Rochester's return to Thornfield Hall didn't bring an immediate encounter, but the following day he sent for me. In the evening, I dressed neatly and went to the large sitting room where Mr. Rochester sat with Mrs. Fairfax and Adele. He asked about my background, inquiring about my long stay at Lowood School, my parents, who were deceased, and my lack of a home or family. I explained my desire to leave Lowood, Mrs. Fairfax's response to my advertisement, and my teaching abilities. Although Mr. Rochester remarked on my youthfulness, he didn't delve further into questioning. In the days that followed, I didn't see him until he sent for me one night, asking me to sit near him while Mrs. Fairfax attended to Adele. In that moment, Mr. Rochester engaged me, questioning if he was handsome or kind. I replied truthfully, stating he wasn't always kind, which he acknowledged. He confessed to a troubled past, admitting he hated Thornfield Hall despite it being his home. Our conversation ended with my departure as it grew late, and despite his query about my fear, I reassured him otherwise. The following nights, Mr. Rochester and I engaged in conversations, but I found his behavior peculiar. I often pondered his unhappiness at Thornfield Hall despite its beauty. One night in March, I was in bed when I heard strange sounds in the corridor outside my room. Investigating, I noticed thick smoke and realized a fire had broken out in Mr. Rochester's room. Rushing to awaken him, I alerted him about Grace Poole's attempt to harm him, prompting him to address the situation. As I waited by the window, Mr. Rochester returned, assuring me of Grace Poole's containment. He expressed gratitude, calling me a dear friend. This interaction left me pondering my feelings for him. I began to realize a growing affection. The next day, Mr. Rochester didn't summon me, so I went to Mrs. Fairfax's sitting room, finding her gazing out of the window. This incident sparked deep reflections about my feelings for Mr. Rochester, though I didn't encounter him that day. Mrs. Fairfax informed me of Mr. Rochester's trip to Ingram Park, where he intended to stay for a week or more with many friends, including Miss Blanche Ingram, whom he had known for years. Mrs. Fairfax mentioned Miss Ingram's beauty and the possibility of marriage between her and Mr. Rochester. Feeling disheartened, I retreated to my room, confronting my reflection, doubting my worth due to my lack of beauty and wealth. I concluded that Mr. Rochester, a wealthy man, would never choose a poor governess like me and would instead marry someone like Miss Blanche Ingram. I attempted to convince myself to forget about him, acknowledging the vast difference in our stations in life. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived announcing Mr. Rochester's imminent return to Thornfield Hall on Thursday, accompanied by several guests. That evening, Mrs. Fairfax, Adele, and I were in Adele's room as guests began to arrive. Among them was Miss Blanche Ingram, a stunning young woman riding a white horse. The following day, Mrs. Fairfax informed us that Mr. Rochester wished to introduce us to his guests that evening. When the time came, Adele and I quietly joined the gathering in the sitting room. Blanche Ingram, tall and captivating, caught Adele's attention immediately, but Miss Ingram didn't engage with me, instead conversing with others. After a while, the gentlemen, including Mr. Rochester, joined the room. Though Mr. Rochester noticed me, he didn't speak to me. Miss Ingram, curious about Adele's education, questioned Mr. Rochester about her living arrangements, and upon mentioning the governess, she made dismissive remarks about past governesses. Later, Miss Ingram and Mr. Rochester sang together. During the guest stay, I attended the evenings in the sitting room with Adele, yet nobody interacted with me. Mr. Rochester and Miss Ingram were often together, singing and enjoying each other's company. One evening, Mr. Rochester returned late, and I informed him of a new guest, Mr. Mason, who arrived from the West Indies. This news visibly unsettled Mr. Rochester. In a shocked state, Mr. Rochester requested a glass of wine, expressing concern about his guest's opinions. Later, he asked me to convey a message to Mr. Mason to meet him in the library. As I lay in bed, I heard Mr. Rochester and Mr. Mason laughing and conversing. However, in the dead of night, a terrifying cry pierced the silence, rousing me from sleep. The guests gathered in the corridor, questioning what had happened, while Mr. Rochester appeared, descending the stairs from the upper corridor, inquiring about the commotion. In the room, Mr. Mason, pale and blood-stained, sat silently in a chair while I assisted quietly under Mr. Rochester's instructions. I tended to Mr. Mason's arm, which was covered in blood, as we waited for the doctor. Mr. Rochester, speaking softly to Mr. Mason, reassured him and planned to fetch medical help. After some time, Mr. Rochester returned with the doctor. Mr. Mason revealed that he had been bitten and was attempting to help someone before the incident occurred. Urgently, Mr. Rochester silenced him, and the doctor attended to his injury, wrapping his arm in a bandage. Finally, Mr. Rochester covered Mr. Mason with his coat. The atmosphere was tense and filled with unanswered questions about the unsettling event involving Grace Poole, a servant. Mr. Rochester's night was unusual. After aiding Mr. Mason and the doctor, I accompanied Mr. Rochester to the garden. As morning approached, he asked if I was frightened. I confessed my fear of Grace Poole and her potential harm. Mr. Rochester assured me he could handle her. He then asked if I'd be his friend, to which I replied affirmatively. He expressed gratitude and reflected on wanting happiness despite past mistakes. Before parting, he instructed me to return to the house, stating we'd speak the following day. However, that day brought a letter from Gateshead Hall. It was from my cousin Eliza. Returning to Gateshead Hall due to my cousin Eliza's urgent letter, I found my Aunt Reed extremely ill. Though she couldn't communicate, after weeks, she finally addressed me, asking if I was indeed Jane Eyre. She mentioned a letter in her desk from my uncle in Madeira. The letter was dated 3 years prior, revealing my uncle's wealth and intention to leave me his fortune. However, Mrs. Reed admitted to falsely informing my uncle of my death, driven by her resentment towards me. That very night she passed away. With my uncle's letter in hand, I departed Gateshead Hall a few days later. Upon my return to Thornfield Hall, Mr. Rochester welcomed me warmly, declaring it my home. I told Mr. Rochester I was happy here. His visitors had left, and we spent time together every day. I started loving him more. In June it was hot, and I went to the garden. Mr. Rochester was there and asked if I liked the house. I said yes. He mentioned Adele going to school soon and wondered if I'd be sad and leave Thornfield. I got upset when he said he'd marry someone else. I thought I should leave. Mr. Rochester asked if I'd marry him. He admitted not marrying Miss Ingram. He said I was poor and not beautiful, but he wanted to marry me. He said he loved me. I agreed to marry him, and we kissed. I went inside, thinking of writing to my uncle about the marriage. I didn't care for expensive gifts. I wanted Mr. Rochester. It was July, close to our wedding. Mr. Rochester told me he'd return the next day. That night, I went to bed early. My wedding dress and veil were there, making me think about becoming Jane Rochester in 2 days. But I couldn't sleep well. The next day, Mr. Rochester came back and noticed something wrong with me. I told him about a strange dream where Thornfield Hall was burnt and roofless, and I couldn't find him. Then in reality, I woke to find a tall woman in my room with long black hair, holding a candle. She put on my wedding veil and laughed after tearing it. Mr. Rochester asked if it was a dream, but it was real. My torn veil was on the floor, but the woman didn't harm me. Mr. Rochester asked me to stay in Adele's room that night to avoid bad dreams. On our wedding day, we headed to a nearby church near Thornfield Hall for the ceremony. As we arrived, I noticed 2 men in a dark corner of the church. The clergyman, as part of the marriage routine, asked if there were any objections. One of the men stood and claimed that Mr. Rochester couldn't proceed as he had a wife, revealing details about Mr. Rochester's past marriage to Bertha Mason. Mr. Rochester was astonished, demanding to know how they knew. Another man, Richard Mason, stepped forward, confirming Bertha was his sister and that he saw her at Thornfield Hall. Mr. Rochester's face turned pale, and after a moment of silence, he admitted the truth. His wife was residing at Thornfield Hall and she was mentally ill. Urgently, he called everyone to the house to witness it. We all left the church, heading back to Thornfield. There was a heavy atmosphere. No one spoke, and even Mrs. Fairfax and Adele wore forced smiles. Mr. Rochester declared that our marriage was invalid. Following him, Briggs, Mr. Mason, the clergyman, and I ascended the stairs to a small room I recognized. From there, he led us to a larger room where Grace Poole and another woman were present. This woman, tall and with dark hair covering her face, turned to us, revealing the same troubled expression I had seen in my bedroom. As she spotted Mr. Rochester, she screamed and lunged at him, prompting Grace Poole to warn him. Despite her strength, Mr. Rochester managed to restrain her. Mr. Rochester spoke angrily, revealing that the woman was his wife, confessing his earlier desire to marry me. Then, in a quiet tone, he admitted his love for me but acknowledged his mistake. He asked everyone to leave, stating he needed to attend to his wife. Downstairs, Mr. Briggs, the lawyer, expressed regret for the situation, mentioning my uncle's illness, who couldn't stop the marriage. I retreated to my room, changed out of my wedding dress into a simple black one, feeling like Jane Eyre today and deciding to depart Thornfield. Hours later, unlocking my door, I found Mr. Rochester waiting, expressing sorrow and proposing we leave Thornfield for a fresh start. However, I declined, stating I couldn't be his wife and had to leave. Despite his pleas, I knew I had to go, bidding farewell to Edward. He shared a troubled story with me, revealing his marriage to Bertha, arranged by his father due to her wealthy family. Unhappily wed, Bertha's madness and wild behavior went undisclosed. After 4 tumultuous years, he brought her to Thornfield Hall, then spent time away, meeting other women, including Adele's mother, without love for any of them. When I arrived, his feelings changed, pleading for me to stay, but I couldn't. Tearfully bidding farewell, I kissed him and swiftly packed to leave Thornfield Hall. Traveling by coach, I gave away my money and ended up stranded without belongings when the driver left me on the road. I was exhausted and hungry, walking alone on a cold, empty moor. As evening approached, I lay down on the ground, falling asleep instantly. The next day, I continued my journey along a rainy road, feeling weary and soaked. I saw a distant house with light, hoping for shelter. Knocking on the door, nobody answered. Feeling hopeless and tired, I thought I might perish there. But then a young man, St. John Rivers, appeared, inviting me into their warm home. His sisters, Diana and Mary, cared for me, offering food and dry clothes. They learned my name was Jane Elliott. I stayed at Moore House for 3 days, becoming friends with the Rivers family. St. Jean, a clergyman, listened to my story about being a governess, although I kept Thornfield Hall and Mr. Rochester's secret. St. Jean had an idea to start a girls' school nearby since many girls in the village lacked education. I decided to teach the girls myself when St. Jean offered to set up a school. 3 days later, a letter arrived. Unfortunately, Uncle John had passed away, but he left his wealth to another unknown niece, not us. I moved to a house by the school and taught the girls every day. But deep down, I wasn't happy. Thoughts of Edward Rochester filled my days. I wondered if he thought of me too. After 4 months, St. Jean visited me with a letter. He asked if I was someone named Jane Elliott and if I knew about Jane Eyre and Mr. Rochester. I didn't immediately respond. St. Jean revealed that a lawyer was searching for Jane Eyre. Mr. Rochester, it seemed, had a troubled past with a mad wife and wanted to marry Jane. But she had left Thornfield. I finally confessed that I wasn't Jane Elliott. I'm Jane Eyre, and I used to work as a governess at Thornfield Hall. St. Jean Rivers informed me about my uncle's passing and that I inherited a considerable fortune. I decided to share it with Diana, Mary, and St. Jean. Months went by without any news from Thornfield or Mr. Rochester. One day, while walking on the moor, I heard his voice calling my name. Excitedly, I rushed to Moore House to discuss going back to Thornfield. Arriving at Thornfield, I found it in ruins. A fire destroyed the house, and I learned Mr. Rochester's wife caused it. She perished in the fire, and Mr. Rochester was severely injured, losing his sight and a hand. I hurried to Ferndene, where he lived, and reunited with him. I decided to stay and care for him. Eventually, we married, and despite his visual impairment, our life together is filled with happiness.